They knew that the owners had broken the law. They knew that the courts had ruled the owners had broken the law. They knew the Crown Solicitor in New South Wales had advised the government the owners had broken the law. The government had threatened to prosecute John Brown because he'd broken the law. Everything pointed to them breaking the law, and here they were under police fire. The miners were under police fire. And I don't think any section of the Australian population in the whole of our history has ever been put through anything like that. I woke up one morning and it was still dark, and the wind was howling in from the North Sea, and I could hear this clatter of hobnailed boots going up the tram tracks. And I realised then that was miners on a very cold winter's morning going to their work. And my reaction was to snuggle back down into the bed and be glad that I was not one of them, and didn't dream at that stage that eventually I would become one of them.
I was reared next door here, and over the road there was a young chap. He married this country girl and brought her there. And one day Dad was coming home from work, and the husband was telling my Dad later that she flung out to him and says, "Oh, come out here and see the little black man with the tin teapot on his hat." And that the first little black man with the tin teapot she'd seen, and that was the miner's lamp.
All employees had to travel, some by bicycles, but the old men generally walked. And sometimes it was miles and miles to get to the pit. And to go to work down the mine could be up to 2, 3 and more miles. And the seam that I started, the pit I started at, the gradient was about 1 in 12. Now, walking down wasn't so bad, but at end of the shift, the aged men felt it most trying to struggle out after filling probably 20 or more tons of coal, plus getting it, of course, had to bore holes with hand machines, and very exhausting. They were working in water because the seam was damp. It was a virgin seam, and the water, they were sometimes up to their knees. And I thought, my God, this is terrible. And by the end of the day, they'd had it, but they struggled out. And I think sometimes one of the reasons for some of the mini strikes was they just hated going down because of the arduousness or the heavy work.
I used to watch Dad coming through the bush after working the full time at the pit, and when he'd come in the yard, his cheeks were practically meeting with exhaustion. And I used to think, oh, how dreadful that a man should have to work to reach that stage physically. So as soon as I'd see him coming through, I'd run inside and I'd make an egg flip. And I'd meet him on the back veranda and give him this egg flip to give him the strength to get washed and get his dinner. And he was always so grateful.
Well, Jack Lang, I think, is correct in his book, The Great Bust, when he said that the Depression in Australia didn't start with a fall in rural prices, it started in the coal industry. I told you, pits were closing down as early as 1927, retrenching. It was quite clear that an industry developed to produce 12 million tonnes for an 8 million tonne market was going to run into trouble. At a conference in Canberra in February, the federal government of Bruce, the state government of Bevan, the colliery proprietors asked the miners to accept a wage reduction and other conditions to be surrendered. Now, the miners were working under a federal award, which had 12 months to run, and it's illegal to work for less than an award. And the governments and the coal owners were asking the miners to break the law.
Well, we were only getting 4 8 a ton, which in our pit was all right, but in a lot of pits was just a living. And we thought, well, if they take that off us, they'll be taking a bit more of us, and that's how it developed into a... It was never the intention of the miners to be on strike for 15 months.
Not a strike, it was a lockout. They locked us out. And everyone got a notice, 14 days from here on you are no longer required. And that lasted for 16 months.
Nobody would believe in those days that we were going into a depression. Everybody said it'll blow over in a few weeks. That was what was the idea when we got the tickets.
We'd lived in almost a slum place in Browns Lane in Curry, and the cheap rent enabled my parents to get a deposit, have a new home built, and they succeeded in getting the new home built on a bank loan, which was as good a home as there was in Curry at that time. But when the lockout came on, it wasn't possible to maintain the payments on that home, and eventually they lost it, something that embittered my mother for the rest of her life. But each time that my old man voted against going back to work in that 15 months, he knew he was losing that home.
The feeding of Colleen was the problem, and as I didn't have sufficient milk for her, we decided to give her cow's milk to make up the leeway, and it disagreed with her, so she got upset in the bowels. She was very, very sick with it. Well, then came the problem of what to do, because we didn't have the money to just go out and buy what we thought. Anyhow, I took her to the doctors, and he suggested putting her on lactogen. Well, then the problem of getting lactogen. So this is one of the questions that the men's organisation was taking up, getting food for babies as well as the food for the family. And that was the time that one point Henry was dealing with, when they grabbed him and battened him out of the police grounds, threw him through the fence out to where the unemployed workers were all standing around.
So I'm getting more confirmed in my idea that the strike was going on too far, that the conditions people were living under, the rations weren't sufficient. And when I'd met a few more of these chaps, Sharkey, he'd been here, Miles, General Secretary, and Ted Docker, he was a wharfie, Roach, another fellow, and Tom Wright had been to the Soviet Union, written a book, Russia Today, and I read that, so I thought now it's time to move on, so I joined the Communist Party.
Henry, of course, he carried on with his political and industrial life, and the UWM, was it, Henry? Yeah. Unemployed Workers Movement was set up, so I went down to one of their meetings and joined, and I got the secretary job for my pains. Well, I found it very exhausting, but when your mind slipped back to why you were there, the reasons, and the brutality you'd seen by the police, and men bashed up for just merely asking for a loaf of bread almost, well, you just get that embroiled in it. You're so annoyed, you're so... well, you want to do mad things. You just want to get out there and make yourself felt.
The federal election took place in October, and the Labor Party looked like being a winner. And Red Ted Theodore, the deputy leader of the Parliamentary Labor Party, addressed the Miners' Central Council, and despite our straitened circumstances, talked them into giving £1,000 to have the Labor government re-elected, that the courageous Labor Party, Labor government, would ensure that the mines would be reopened on pre-lockout conditions, and my boss, John Brown, was going to be prosecuted for an illegal lockout. Well, they got the £1,000, they got the posters out, they got elected, and then immediately told us to get the best conditions we could because the bastards couldn't do anything to help us.
Around about December 1929, the government decided to reopen 3 of the mines with volunteer labour. The first mine selected for reopening was Rothbury. On the Friday, a special train came in with free labourers and all sorts of building materials and tradesmen. The free labourers were to be accommodated in tents, and the police, who had been guarding the property for a couple of weeks, they were billeted in mostly in the colliery office. It was amazing the speed with which they put those buildings up. The train arrived on the Thursday, and by the Friday night all the buildings were just about complete, plumbing and all.
Of course, the peaceful atmosphere of the lockout had disappeared by this time, and everybody was outraged by this move, and huge meetings were called on the Sunday night right through the coalfields, and the decisions were made to go to Rothbury.
I think they were in a dilemma because we were getting nowhere. So they put this Rothbury stud on, or stud I suppose you'd call it, and we of course all religiously obeyed the order and marched out there in hundreds and hundreds. And we went out the night before, and Grace and her mother and all the other women were on the School of Arts corner as we marched around. We were waving, ta-da, a bit of fun like.
Well, we got to Rothbury as the sun was rising. And I remember I was puzzled where the sun was. It wasn't where I thought it should have been. Blood red ray shooting through the bush, and as it rose, you could see this curtain of dust rising up from all these blokes marching with their pit boots and this bloody wild pipe band leading us on. You vibrated with excitement. We met the Cessnock blokes on the top of the hill, and there was nobody there to organise the blasted thing. There's no union executives there at all.
There was a bit of a cover there, a gully rang up here, and we thought we'd get up there and with some idea of getting near the scabs so we might do something with them, you know.
The Cessnock miners were marching up and down, protesting. The Rothbury paddock that the mine was in was very well covered with tea tree scrub. We got the shock of our lives when you see what was in that scrub.
Back on the road, the colliery fence was there, and the pipe band turned in, and a young white-faced policeman came out. He stared at us, and everybody stared back at him, and he kept saying, "You can't come in here, boys. You can't come in here." And Sheridan had his foot on the bottom rail of the fence. He said, "Look, we don't want any trouble with you blokes. All we do is want to talk to these scabs and get them out of here so there won't be any trouble." But the trouble was bubbling then because the return soldiers could see army tents in the compound to house the scabs. And it wouldn't matter what anybody had done that day, they were going to try and get in there to destroy those tents.
The coppers was lined up there and there was no shooting at that time, and he just walked up and hit this fella down the face with his baton, and the blood spurted all over his face. Well, that really upset me, and a few more, I suppose. And that's when I thought I'd have a go to get inside.
And there's a policeman, had an old bloke down, nobody retired early at the pits in those days. He was into this bloke with a baton. His face was a mask of blood and obviously unconscious, but he was still working on him with this baton, and the policeman's face was just a bloody mask of fury, you know, sheer hatred and rage.
I couldn't believe that they would go so far with their attitude towards human beings. I'd experienced the 1917 strike when the Aberdare Extended Mine had scabs. There was a big meeting called, and then there was a fracas there. Even returned soldiers got knocked over then. During the war, they'd be come back. But at Rothbury, when we got through the fence at Rothbury, all types, young and old, and then the mounted troopers came in, and they mercifully with their batons flogged aged men.
You just can't describe what that was like. And the mounted police couldn't stop them. And that was where it looked as though the miners could get out into the open. And it was then that the shooting started.
The funny part about it, you know, I suppose all of us that have never took part in wars, we wonder what would be the feeling. Well, it was a strange thing to me. I never felt frightened. I don't think anybody did, although we ducked for cover. But the mob is standing out the street saying, "Shoot me, you bastards, shoot me." And I said, "Get yourself out of the road, they will shoot you, you're invited to shoot you." But they didn't shoot him. I lived a long time after that.
I always think about it with a bit of humour that Ike Thorpe, he lives in Western still, I think, and he said, "We better get out." And there was bullets whining overhead, you know, in this bit of scrub we was in. And I said, "Yeah, there's that bullet. You can hear it whine a bit, you know, the bullet come through." He said, I said, "Ike, that's another one, another bullet, you know, as we run, you know, through to get back out on the road." And he said, "No, that's the same one." He reckons we'd caught up with it. I always think about that. They would laugh, you know.
As we were getting through the slip rail fence, obviously retreating away from the bashes that were going on, this policeman fired. He could have hit me, but he hit Bob. And when I seen what happened, his hat was off and the blood streaming down his face. And he said, "Fill up again, you bastard, have another go."
A car came towards the gate and the cry went up. It was Weaver, the most detested bloke amongst the miners that you could think about. And the rush came on again. And the bloke, Ashcroft, the goalkeeper in the Curry Soccer Club, smashed the window of the car in with a waddy, knocked the chauffeur out. Another bloke, Roger Mabry, who was killed in Killingworth Colliery later on, was carving the tyres up with a knife. And the police came out shooting in all directions to protect the blokes in the car. Well, unfortunately, it wasn't Weaver, it was Bob Jack, the mines inspector, somebody that the miners had a great respect and liking for. But this was where the more serious fighting took place. There were miners and police grappling all over the road inside the compound, police farther back shooting as hard as they could, and that's where Norman Brown was shot.
The shooting was going on quite, quite frequent. And when I saw what was taking place, I went over, and here was Brown lying there with this gaping stomach wound. Terrible thing. It made me sick to look at it. And I realised then that his time was up. And I feel very sorry to think that, for him, but it could have been anybody. And my brother Mick was present, and he accompanied him to the hospital. But Mick, talking to Mick about it, he says, "Poor fella, poor bugger," he said. He died before we got there.
There was lots of things happened when we first went in that we had to get out or get shot, one of the two. And I was one of the unlucky ones that got shot.
I'd seen the car go into the colliery paddock, and the cameraman, losing his camera, the miners kicked it up, thinking the car had the Minister for Mines, Weaver. But it wasn't Mr. Weaver at all, it was Bob Jack, the coal inspector. And then at that time, there was shooting going on at the gate. And looking down, I saw this chap get hit. I didn't know he hit to the throat until later, but he just spiraled around and fell like a stick.
I was running down towards the fence, and could have touched a bloke from Richmond Lane, Wally Woods, who I'd worked with, and I saw this bloke rise out of a bush in police uniform, steadied the revolver, deliberately aimed at Wally Woods and shot him through the throat.
Wally Woods was, he was only as far as that door off me when he hit the ground like as if somebody had threw him out of an aeroplane. And I think Wally thought he was gone. I did too.
That's the kind of thing you see happening, and you can't believe you're seeing it. He's lying on the ground, blood gurgling out of his throat, making strangled noises in his heels, drumming the ground.
Let me think. Some fellow with a car was taking his kids for a picnic, and he tipped them out the car and put me in the car after I'd been shot, and run me straight into Branxton.
Police were ordered to fire into the ground and into the air. There was much argument about that. The bullet that killed Norman Brown appeared to have been a ricochet. There were marks on it that were said by an expert to be gravel marks, but miners claimed that those marks were caused by fingernail impressions in the lead.
The day of the funeral, you couldn't have dropped the cigarette paper here, you know, the crowd that were here.
That's true, yes.
And the bloke that was officiating,
Yeah.
you remember him saying,
Yeah.
the dead aren't crying for revenge, and the
Yes.
crowd growled back, give us guns.
There was a very simple man, honest and quiet, yet he became the mate of every working man. And every miner knows his name. Oh, Norman Brown, oh, Norman Brown, the murdering coppers, they shot him down. They shot him down in Rothbury town. A working man called Norman Brown. An honest man, the parson said, and dropped the clods upon his head. But honest man or not, he's dead. To live forever, Norman Brown.
There was a terrific reaction in Sydney and round the state. There were huge meetings of protest in the domain called by the New South Wales Trades and Labour Council and the Labor Party. Jack Lang was the leader of the Labor Party, the state Labor Party leader, and he opposed what Scullin, Federal Labor Party, was doing and so on. So there was a terrific public reaction to what was going on, and for once, public opinion was on the side of the miners. Well, for the next 6 months, you know, it's not an exaggeration to say there's a reign of terror. That from Maitland to Cessnock, from December to June, there were police wagons with 8 police on board sitting 4 back to back. And they passed what was called the Unlawful Assemblies Act. So if more than 3 people were standing in the street talking about cricket, the weather or whatever, it was an unlawful assembly. It was in Curry and Cessnock, but not in Vaucluse and Rose Bay. They get off these wagons and batten you into the ground.
When the Pashagan came over the hill in their sidecars and cars and bikes, Dad was right in line. But when they stopped, they grabbed Dad, and he was a fighter. He fought them, and some of the chap told us later, afterwards that there was about 5 coppers with their truncheons, belting Dad into insensibility. They brought him unconscious.
The depression was developing. Some of the mines that were still working were closing down because of the loss of markets due to the approaching depression. It became quite clear it was an impossible position. The federal Labor government was going to do nothing. The Bavin government was going to do all it could, acting as the agents of the employers. And after 15 months, everybody was just too exhausted to keep it going. But it wasn't an easy return to work, where normally there'd be aggregate meetings of the miners from all the pits combined to reach those decisions. The situation was so tense it was decided each miner's lodge would make its own decision. And I recollect the big meeting at the Richmond Main Lodge. The decision to go back to work was only carried by about 100 votes, majority. And instead of taking a show of hands, or the motion on the voices, the chairman called for an immediate division. All those in favour of return to work on my left, all those against on my right. So like the Red Sea, they divided. And wasn't a sound. Both sides just stared at each other. And somebody from the no side called out, "Where's Norman Brown now?" That's all that was said. What you've got to realise is those blokes have been through 1914-18, 1921 in the old country, 1926 in the old country, out here with the native born. They knew that the owners had broken the law. They knew that the courts had ruled the owners had broken the law. They knew the Crown Solicitor in New South Wales had advised the government the owners had broken the law. The government had threatened to prosecute John Brown because he'd broken the law. Everything pointed to them breaking the law, and here they were under police fire. The miners were under police fire. And I don't think any section of the Australian population in the whole of our history has ever been put through anything like that.
We've never forgiven them for that, and we will never forgive them. And the system itself will suffer, the capitalist system, as a result. They do the things that are contrary to their maintenance of their power. It'll go.
Well, I think it was a lesson to the government and a lesson to the miners too. It's something that we've seen before, seen afterwards with the English coal strikes, for instance. I don't think anyone gains by a strike. And in the case of Rothbury, well, the miners finally went back on the terms that they were offered.
You can't go through that. You can't go through that without it getting inside you. And if it had to happen, you know, a thing like that had to happen. If somebody said, "Do you want to go through that?" I'd say, "No, I don't want to go through that." But this might be a contradiction. If it had to happen, I'm glad I had that experience.
Well, I don't know. I can't help as much because I'm getting too old and can't remember, you know. But I remember we was in there with grand ideas of grabbing the scabs, and we did no good there, and instead of that, the police knocked some of us off.
A miner's pick is in his hand, his song is shouted through the land, a land that's free and broad and brown, the land that bred us Norman Brown. Oh, Norman Brown, oh, Norman Brown, the murderous coppers, they shot him down, they shot him down in Rothbury town. A working man